Hello there. It's Reverend Tasha Blackburn from First Presbyterian Church. And I want to share with you today the third week of our Sunday school class on the great ends of the church, what's called the great ends of the church. And we are calling this series To What End? Why the Church Matters. And the great ends of the church, as a reminder, were written in 1904 by the Presbyterian Church, and but they are not denominational. They represent the six main goals, aims, reasons for the church's existence in the world. And so this is a third one, and it is called the shelter, nurture, and spiritual fellowship of the children of God. That is an aim and a goal of the church in the world, is to shelter, nurture, and provide spiritual fellowship for the children of God. So in Sunday school, we've talked about this, and we talked about some definitions first. What do we think of when we think of shelter? How do we define shelter? And shelter makes us think of safety, of providing safety, of being a physical place, kind of a refuge. It also makes us think of support and even of something temporary. Shelter is a little different than the word home, for example. So is it something we only live under temporarily? And so when we think of shelter, how does that differ from nurture? If we are to both shelter and nurture the children of God, what's the difference between sheltering them and nurturing them? And it seems like nurturing has sort of this passing of time piece to it. Uh, it's raising something up, or training, like we think of nurturing a child and training them up and raising them in a way that helps them grow. We can think of nourishment or of the sustenance we need in this life. All of that seems to be under the language of nurture. And I want to read for you a little bit from in the Presbyterian Church. We have a creed that we sometimes say in worship that's called the Brief Statement of Faith. Isn't that a creative name? And under the Holy Spirit piece of that creed, it says this. It says, the Spirit justifies us by grace through faith, sets us free to accept ourselves and to love God and neighbor, and binds us together with all believers in the one body of Christ, the church. It goes on to say that the Spirit rules our faith and life, engages us, claims us, feeds us, calls us. All of that language there that sets us free, binds us together, engages us, claims us, feeds us. That feels a lot like nurture language, doesn't it? That we're getting raised up in the faith, and that is one of the aims of the church, is to help those who are in it to get raised up in the faith, nurtured, engaged, claimed, fed. So we think about shelter, this even physical place, a canopy in our lives. We think about nurture, that ongoing nourishment and sustenance we need. And then we think about spiritual fellowship, the third of the three. And what is spiritual fellowship? You know, the blanket answer would be it's every time we come together within the church walls and outside them. It can be when you might even think you're just grabbing coffee with someone, and 10 minutes in, you realize, oh, wait, there's a lot more going on here than coffee. We are having spiritual fellowship together. It can happen at the church potluck, and it can happen in the hallway, and it can happen in Sunday school class, and it can happen when a group prays together. All of those things can start to make up the spiritual fellowship that the church is called to provide in this world, and to the people who come to it. And I think it's an interesting thing to point out here, where that the Greeks, and the New Testament is written in Greek, the Greeks had a really interesting understanding of time that we don't necessarily have language for, but we can steal their language, which we should. So they had chronos time, which is where we get the word chronological. And chronos time is days, minutes, seconds, hours. It is time by the clock, right? That's chronos time. But then they also had this other understanding of time, and they called it kairos time. And that was not time by the clock. That was time that, even if you didn't notice it in the moment, when you looked back at it, you thought, that was time pulled out of time. That was special time. That was sacred time. And it's not even related to days, seconds, weeks, hours. It is sort of God shaped time. And all of us, I think, can point to moments in our lives where, even if we didn't notice it in the moment, when we remember that event, it was Kairos time. It was God shaped time for us. And that has to do with spiritual fellowship, in that you might think, and we as a family of faith might think, oh, I'm just doing this and then headed to a meeting and making a phone call. And I think I'm going to have lunch with this person. And that Chronos time gets interrupted by Kairos time. And when it does that, we've hit spiritual fellowship, right? That spiritual fellowship that the church is called to provide and be part of has come upon whoever was involved in it, right? So, shelter, nurture, and spiritual fellowship. There's some definitions. As we look at those definitions and this great aim of the church, I want to give us 4 metaphors that have been offered for the church. And these are 4 ordinary things that we can sometimes helps us better understand what the church is called to, what we're doing here. And they are this: church as a fortress, church as a boat, church as a nest, and church as a frontier. Okay, got me? So frontier, boat, nest. I did those in the wrong order. Fortress, boat, nest, frontier. And I want to talk about each of those for a moment. The first 2, fortress and boat, if you've ever been to First Presbyterian Church, you know that our space physically embodies both of those. Our outer walls look like they should have turrets. We are so close to a fortress style in the style of building. And when we think of fortress, what does that evoke? What does that tell us about our vision of church? Again, we're back to that idea of safety. We're back to that idea of a place of refuge, a stronghold for us. We also, along with some of those pretty positive connotations, it can dip into some maybe less positive connotations, where it's like, oh, there's safety inside, danger outside. Or even that can devolve into sealing us off. We are closed off. There is us and there is them. Fortress can kind of go into that. It can go down that road if we aren't careful. But it also has those very positive and comforting images of stronghold and refuge. When we look at boat, which in our church is signified, if you look up in our sanctuary, the sanctuary is built so that the roof of it looks like an upturned boat. So a boat put above us. And it was done that way on purpose, so that there would be this boat sense, even in the way the building was built. So how does boat as a metaphor differ from fortress? Well, a boat can also evoke safety. I'm going to be dry-ish in this boat versus I know I'll be all wet outside the boat, that kind of idea. But a boat is all of a sudden in motion, right? Where a fortress isn't. So a boat is like, okay, we're headed somewhere here. There is a path and a direction. There is work to do together for everyone who's in the boat. Somebody's got to row, you know? So there's that kind of feel with a boat. Um, and also, there's this idea of fishing, even, which of course is a very strong gospel metaphor, that people who follow Jesus are supposed to go fish for people in his name. So we get that kind of idea of a boat as well. Um, and I want to remind you, one of the earliest sort of icons or drawings representing the church is this idea of a boat. And it would be sort of a boat that's in stormy seas and everyone's rowing. And at the front of the boat, at the bow, stands Christ. So there's that idea too of we all have a common work to do here together. It may not be easy sailing, but Christ stands at the head of the boat, and he makes our way for us. He sets the way for this boat. Okay, so fortress, boat, and then nest. Julian of Norwich, who is Christian mystic from eras gone by. She is the one who came up with this metaphor for the church. She said that it's like a robin's nest. And what does that evoke that might be slightly different or have commonalities with fortress and boat? There's still this idea of sort of safety, and maybe even a greater understanding or evoking of nurture. I mean, literally what happens in a nest is babies get fed, right? And we've all heard the chirp, 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 they don't stop until they get fed. So this idea of a nest, of protection, although now we're kind of moved into, it's a little more fragile protection, right? A nest is vulnerable. The idea of guidance and growth in the nest, and even the idea of it's a place you fly away from. That's kind of a, it's a place that nurtures you until you're able to fly again. That's kind of an interesting idea to think about for the church. Then the last one, frontier. This one is not as commonly talked about, but it really should be in the church. We are starting to wake up to some of the meaning and places, literally places we can go in our thought process about church and what the role of church is when we think about frontier. The idea of church as frontier is that actually the building of the church is not church. Even the coming together in the sanctuary for worship is not the church. Churching happens all week long out there, where we live and work and live. We are churching all the time. And we do that out on the frontier, right? And then we come back together, basically as like a pit stop to get refilled, so that we can go back out to the frontier again. So it broadens this idea of church and says churching is happening out there all the time. And sort of the church itself, the church and the hour of worship is a pit stop to stop into so that we can go church again. So that's a very different idea. It's an out there idea rather than inside here. The church is inside this place. Come on in and join us. It changes that idea and says, hey, we're going to join you out there because that's where churching is happening. So it's this dispersal idea. There's no walls. It's the idea of movement that the boat gave us. There's also movement in this metaphor of church. So, shelter, nurture, and spiritual fellowship we are to provide for the children of God. And we think about those four metaphors, and there are many more for the church, but there's four. And what does shelter, nurture, and spiritual fellowship look like under those sort of fuller recognitions of church? Well, I would like to offer a fifth metaphor, and it combines a little bit some of these, and I think we find it in Scripture in several places. The first word for church in the New Testament, in Greek, is ekklesia. The ecclesia. It's where we get the word ecclesiology, ecclesia, and it literally means those who are sent out. Boy, that's some frontier language, right? Those who are sent out. That's the church. The definition of church in those earliest days was those who are sent out. So while we think of church often as the place we come to do our faith, which is pretty fortressy, right? Language. What if we went down that path of a lot of us doing church is out there on a Wednesday, and that the church itself is that sort of pit stop, that temporary shelter. We talked about how feels like there's a different definition for shelter versus home, right? That temporary nature of it. We come here for that temporary shelter to then be sent out again. And it's this continuation of coming in for the pit stop and the temporary way station, right? And then going back out again. And I think we see this in the idea of a roadside inn, okay? Maybe I'll just say it, a roadside motel. Maybe it can help us think about the church and our role for people who come into the church if we are a roadside inn. So here is a parable that Jesus told that I think you are going to recognize, where I believe this roadside inn comes into play. And it's from Luke 10. A lawyer has come and wants to know who his neighbor is. He's been told he is to love his neighbors, and he wants to check in on the details. So who is my neighbor, Jesus, if I'm supposed to love them? Good question, right? And Jesus tells this parable, which is one of his most famous. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii, 2 coins, and gave them to the innkeeper and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend." Which of these 3, Jesus said, do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The man said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." The obvious message of this parable is that we are to go and be like the Good Samaritan, right? Jesus says it at the end of the parable. Go and do likewise. Love your neighbor. The definition of neighbor is the person who's hurt right near you. That's your neighbor, no matter what else about them. If you see them and they are in need, they're your neighbor. So we have, you can't even name how many hospitals or clinics. We have one in our own town, or helping agencies have taken the name, right? The Good Samaritan. All over our country and all over the world have taken the name of Good Samaritan, because we do understand this basic teaching of the parable. Go and be a Good Samaritan. But there is also this other layer, as is so common in the parables, necessary in the parables, that is that actually the Good Samaritan here is Jesus himself. He sees people in the ditch, hurting and in a bad way, and he picks them up, he binds their wounds, and then he brings them to the inn. He brings them to the church and he says, this is my person I'm bringing to you. I have prepaid his bill. And will you tend to him until I come back? That's really powerful. When you think that anyone who seeks to enter a faith community, enter a Christian community, we can so often think, are they here for the right reasons? Do we think they're here just because they want to talk to the pastor after church and see what maybe they can get? Do we think they're here just because they're church shopping and they're not serious? Do we think they're here, for all kinds of reasons? It can really, really change our hearts if we will flip that script and say, anyone who has sought to enter a Christian community has been brought here by Jesus, the ultimate Good Samaritan. And Jesus is vouching for this person and says, you're going to accept this person and nurture and shelter them because I've paid their bill. Boy, that's a theological statement, right? I have paid their bill. And whatever else needs to be paid, I will pay upon my return. And in this in-between time, in the meantime, that's your work, church. You shelter and nurture the ones I bring to you. Wow. So maybe as church, we can add that other metaphor. We are a roadside motel that Jesus brings wounded people to. This brings up so many different thoughts we could have, but here are just a few that does take the idea of feelings out of it. We don't need to lean into our feelings about the people who come into our church, positive or negative, because we base it on Jesus has brought this person. Jesus brought this person. And we don't know where it will go, but I know my role in it. I know that in the meantime, until he comes back, he's paid their bill. He's brought them. And I am to shelter and nurture them. We are to shelter and nurture them in the meantime. It also helps us think, because so often in so many group settings, and the church is no different, we can start to feel like I can't come to church until I have it all together. I can't come to church. My life is falling apart. I can't come to church because I'm not sure I can fake it and say everything's fine. And so we don't come. Or if we do come, we paste a smile on our face and we say everything's fine. But this reminds us that no one who comes through those doors or no one who enters that faith community wasn't pulled out of the ditch. Every single one of us, in one way or another, at one time in our lives or another, was pulled out of the ditch. That's one of the reasons we're here, is because Jesus pulled us out of the ditch and we are broken and bleeding. And we have come to the church because we need that nurture and shelter. So many of us feel like we have to fake the face, everything at church. And hopefully we can start to trust one another and over time be open with one another, that it's like, no, I'm another one of the ditch dwellers who barely got here today. But because Jesus picked me up, I did at least get through the doorway. So these are some really good things for us to think about, I think, when we think about that goal of sheltering, nurturing, and providing a spiritual fellowship to the children of God. Be in that roadside motel for anyone who comes our way. As we end, I want to think about so many of the ends of the church, these great aims of the church, tell us what the church's job is. It's this, and this. This is the what. And this one tells us really how are we going to do it. It's not really a what. It's how are we going to be with each other? How are we going to treat each other? What are those parameters? And so as we think about our life together, this is not just a what, this is a how. I look forward to talking with you again next week. And next week's small church goal, very, very minuscule church goal, is that we are to join in, echo, and mirror the worship that's going on in heaven. A very small goal, as I mentioned. Until then, peace to you all.